Most fair-minded, justice-minded people do not believe that you should have to have a certain political viewpoint to be able to obtain a banking relationship. If you can go direct to the Fed, your cost of a Fed wire or ACH transaction it can be as little as 1/100th of what you pay retail. So the bank's retail markup of their wholesale cost can be as much as 100x. People have evolved to use as money whatever people choose to use as the most commonly used good that becomes the medium of exchange. And with Bitcoin, that happens to be a digital good. With fiat, it happens to be a piece of paper with a dead US president printed on it in green ink in the US. What is that worth? Well, right now, people give it a lot more value than the intrinsic worth of a piece of linen with, green ink on it. But that won't always be the case.
This podcast is entertainment, not financial, tax, or legal advice. Views expressed represent statements of the speaker in their individual capacity, do not represent the views of Unchained, and should not be considered investment advice. Speakers often have personal, family, or business connections to Unchained, which may include direct financial benefits. Please see our disclosure at unchained.com/podcast.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Bitcoin Frontier podcast. This week, I have on Caitlin Long. Caitlin.
Hey, good to see you again, Joe. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Glad to have you. For those that don't know you, can you kind of explain your professional background and in particular in your background, why did your background lead you to building Custodia?
I have a Wall Street background, trained as a lawyer, very much did a lot of regulatory work in my Wall Street career and helped my native state of Wyoming after I moved back in 2019, but in part because Wyoming was a place where we could get recognized. Back in 2017, when no one would recognize us, Wyoming was willing to define Bitcoin as property that could be owned, and therefore, if it's stolen, it's theft, and define the rights and obligations of parties from a commercial law perspective, as Trace Mayer liked to say it, made it backwards compatible with the legal system so that the courts were not an attack vector on our Bitcoin. And I moved back home to my native state from New York in 2019, started Custodia in large part, because we heard testimony in Wyoming from multiple entrepreneurs in this space that they lost their businesses due to debanking in 2017. And Wyoming wanted to try to help solve that problem.
I love it. So your goal with Custodia is really just to make banking open for everyone and making sure like the government can't crack down on anyone in particular?
Yeah, and it's been hard under this Biden-Warren crew. but yes, ultimately, that's what we are. And it's so interesting because we've seen it just even in the past few weeks, a big increase in word of mouth. Custodia is open and we're banking this sector. And law-abiding companies, if in the states that we're licensed, we're not licensed in every state. And to be clear, we're not FDIC insured. But in the states where we are able to operate, we are able to help solve that debanking problem for this industry. There is another debanking crackdown underway. It's almost like the revenge of this Biden-Warren crew on our industry. That's the last gasp of power because they're already past their peak power. But they're doing strange things, almost to take revenge on the industry. We can talk about it, but what the SEC did at the end of last week to say, oh, just kidding, on SAB 121, which was an accounting rule designed to kill the industry. Well, Congress voted to overturn it. Biden vetoed the overturn, and then Congress didn't get enough votes on Thursday of last week to overturn the overturn. But then the SEC leaked to Bloomberg, oh, we're letting select large banks have exemptions from this accounting standard. You can't make this up. But it's just evidence of just the bad faith and arbitrariness designed to try to, while they're still in power, maybe only for their last several months here, depending upon the outcome of the election, they're just trying to crack down as hard as they can because they just hate us.
Fair. So I guess your perspective is with the election, that is how there might be hope. It's going to take like new leadership in office to really, prevent this crackdown from continuing.
That's part of it. But let's face it, also the industry's winning in court cases. That's been happening now for the last year. I mean, the SEC must be just so angry because they've lost so many court cases. They haven't lost every one, but you can just see the anger and the seething contempt that certain of the appointees, it's not everyone at the agencies. I mean, obviously Custodia's experience is mostly with the Fed. We had our supporters at the Fed, but this Warren crew was the problem. And it's, I know exactly who the people are at the Fed that were the issue. I don't know the people at the SEC because we didn't deal with the SEC, but certainly, the Coinbases and Krakens and Ripples of the world would know exactly who the culprits are at the SEC. And it's certainly the political appointees that were under Warren's control, but it's also some of the senior staff at these agencies as well that are part of. One of the insiders referred to them as the Warren corruption racket. That's his phrase, not mine, but it was an interesting phrase. Let's put it that way.
I want to hear more about your experience with the Fed. I know you've had issues like trying to get a master account at the Federal Reserve. Maybe can you kind of explain like what even is a master account at the Federal Reserve, and then talk about your experience working with them?
Yeah, the Bitcoin ethos of be your own bank is a nice concept, but it's going to take us some time to get there. And so why does a Bitcoiner even care? If we're able to go peer-to-peer or truly DeFi, then we don't care. But we're not there yet. I think even the most hardcore Bitcoiners recognize that some of the service providers and even the DeFi exchanges, they still need to pay people in fiat, and they still need to pay their lawyers and their accountants and their other, their employees and other service providers in fiat. So there does still need to be some connectivity, even in the best case, to the traditional financial system. And I believe that these two financial systems can coexist without hurting each other. They both hurt each other in 2022. And I think that's unfortunate because we were trying so hard at Custodia to prevent that exact outcome. We want both systems to coexist. And it's like Saifedean and I said in a podcast, we had a big discussion of this very question of, if you're hardcore Bitcoiner, you think the fiat system is unstable, which it is, but do you want it to collapse? And the answer is no, you don't want to live in a world where the collapse of the fiat system happens quickly and unwieldy. You want people to be able to vote with their feet and have it collapse with a whimper, not a bang. And he and I both concluded that that's probably what's going to happen, that people should have the choice. We want freedom of choice to transact. And as a result, whatever they use as money will ultimately be whatever people use. And guess what? That's human history. People have evolved to use as money whatever people choose to use as the most commonly used good that becomes the medium of exchange. And with Bitcoin, that happens to be a digital good. With fiat, it happens to be a piece of paper with a dead US president printed on it in green ink in the US. What is that worth? Well, right now, people give it a lot more value than the intrinsic worth of a piece of linen with, green ink on it. But that won't always be the case, and people can choose. And folks who are no coiners, who think Bitcoin has no value, Godspeed, keep using fiat. The rest of us will choose and walk with our feet.
Fair. So can you kind of like dive into like a master account at the Federal Reserve? Yeah.
I didn't answer your question.
No
Sorry
worries.
about that. Yeah, it's a bank. It's a bank account for banks. So I answered the question, why do we need it? But the answer then is it's a bank account for banks. And so what we were experiencing is that this industry has gone through now 3 cycles of debanking. In the early cycle, this was back when like the Coinbases of the world were able to keep their banking relationships and some of the other competitors were not, and they went out of business. So keeping a bank account, keeping durable banking relationships was the difference between who survived and who did not. And then, like I said, there was another wave in 2017, and then we're in this the third wave of it now. And so what we want ultimately is a crypto native company to be able to have its own master account, because then we control our own destiny. We are absolutely going to have to comply with all of the rules and requirements of being a bank. And that relates to capital requirements. It relates to the compliance requirements of anti-money laundering and know your customer and counterterrorism of financing. And absolutely, Custodia is complying with all the applicable rules and regulations that apply to us as a bank. And so, again, this is not for the peer-to-peer crowd, but it is for the law-abiding crowd. It's fine. And again, it keeps the US dollar connectivity that ultimately supports the industry. From my perspective, I think it's fine that there's a regulated lit market that exists in parallel with the dark market. It's just like with telecom. You can make a voice over internet protocol phone call yourself from the command line interface if you want to, or like a browser. You can use Tor if you want to. Why do most people not use the command line interface for a phone call? Because, frankly, using one of these is just more convenient and for most people more secure. And so they voluntarily migrate towards lit markets. I think that that's going to be the same in Bitcoin. It will ultimately mostly take place, especially onshore and in the developed economies, in regulated markets. However, you will never be able to shut down. No one will ever be able to shut down the peer-to-peer nature of these technologies. And that's the escape valve that prevents the ability for regulators to kill it. Because, and we all know, just like you can't kill the internet because Tor and the like exist, no one will ever be able to kill Bitcoin. It's just code. And computers don't recognize borders. So I would encourage the regulators, and have been encouraging the regulators, to just, instead of trying to bash us over the head and kill us, recognize they'll never succeed at that. Frankly, a lot of them aren't sophisticated enough, especially the octogenarians aren't sophisticated enough to understand why they'll never succeed at that. But ultimately, just the existence of the ability to go peer to peer, that's what keeps the discipline in the markets.
Yeah, I completely agree, especially that one. Can you kind of also provide like a brief overview of what's happening now with Custodia Bank versus the Federal Reserve, that case?
Yeah, well, so the Fed denied us our master account. We filed a lawsuit. The district court sided with the Fed. We filed an appeal. And I can't talk much about that other than to say last week, 7 amicus briefs were filed in our case. And there are now 3 former solicitors general of the U.S. and 1 former solicitor general of Virginia on our side. The legal firepower that our industry lined up to support us is incredible. And frankly, it includes some so-called strange bedfellows, because 2 of the solicitors general were famous for facing off against each other in a lot of famous cases, like the Obamacare case. Don Verrilli, who was Obama's solicitor general, faced off against Paul Clement, who was Bush's solicitor general. And Don Verrilli's successor, Ian Gershengorn, is Custodia's attorney, along with Michelle Callan, who herself made a name in some famous cases. So it's fun to see how much the legal community has come together in a bipartisan way to say, look, what the Fed did to Custodia and to the digital asset industry in general was wrong.
This episode is sponsored by Sound Advisory, an Unchained affiliate. If you can't talk about your Bitcoin wealth with your financial advisor, it might be time to find a new advisor. Sound Advisory is a leading financial advisory firm for long-term Bitcoin holders like yourself. If you need help optimizing taxes, establishing goals, creating a distribution plan for Bitcoin wealth, or designing estate and inheritance plans, then check out Sound Advisory at thesoundadvisory.com for more information. That's thesoundadvisory.com. Now back to the show.
Are you able to elaborate on, and I understand, I guess, if you can't, but why they, or the reason that they gave to denying Custodia's Fed Master account?
Oh, they threw everything at us from, let's put it this way. They put an 86-page explanation for why they denied Custodia's membership application. And it was literally every possible thing we could possibly have done wrong. That whole thing was very political. It was the longest ever Fed denial order was 3 pages. Ours was 86. Okay. This was designed to send a message to the industry. Don't bother. It was a shoot the stallion to scatter the herd strategy. We actually thought at the time that we were going to get a Fed master account. It was definitely going to take us more time. We didn't make it on what's called the first exam. But the Fed in the past has given as many as 3 exams to banks to be able to become a Fed member bank. And they actually said in writing, we said this in our lawsuit, so it's not breaking news. They actually said in writing that they were going to give us a second exam. and asked us for a remediation plan for the punch list, which we finished on time. But then they rug pulled, and there were all kinds of procedural issues. It's kind of just like with the SEC. The Fed just ignored their own internal procedures. We lost our ability to appeal any of those findings because we relied on their representation, their written representation that we were going to get a second exam, much less a third exam if we needed it, but we would have made it on the second exam. Anyway, long story short, it was all political. That's now subsequently been confirmed to me by a very, very senior Fed insider who was actually witnessing the whole thing. It was all about crypto. It was not about Custodia. It was not about the specifics of our business plan, our management team. They threw some just outrageous things to try to make it seem like we were the worst, most unsafe and unsound thing ever. We've been operating without issue since October 2022. And this tiny Wyoming bank, for the Fed to say that this was such a threat to financial stability is just a freaking joke.
Yeah, it seems like super interesting and kind of weird. I guess like you mentioned how like Custodia is currently operating already and you haven't really had any issues. Like what, other than the fact that it just a Fed master account gives you the ability to have a bank account for a bank. Like what, how much will that help you if you're able to eventually get a Fed master account? Like why, if you're already operating, like what's the difference?
Okay, so take a look at the Don Verrilli amicus brief. It goes into the history of Operation Choke Point 2.0. It's very real. It's happened to Custodia multiple times. We do have thankfully, other banking partners, but what does it mean to have a banking partner? A, the bank doesn't have to continue to service you, unlike the Fed, which would have to. There's a stability question. B, there's a counterparty credit risk question. We'd love to face the Fed as a counterparty directly because it's essentially got an unlimited balance sheet, whereas we're facing a bank that's a corporation that has counterparty credit risk with our partners. And most importantly, well, maybe not most importantly, but certainly from a financial perspective, if you can go direct to the Fed, your cost of a Fed wire or ACH transaction it can be as little as 1/100th of what you pay retail. So the bank's retail markup of their wholesale costs can be as much as 100x. Also we did disclose. I did disclose in testimony that when we had to replace one of our banking partners, it impacted 1.5 million lines of code. It is not simple to just pull out one bank and replace it with another. And the funny thing is, I can tell that the senior regulators who don't understand technology fought that because they would ask the question, why don't you just go get a correspondent bank? It's not that simple. And again, I think they're living in an old paradigm where it was simple, but it's not simple when you're trying to bring cloud-based, API-based technologies to the fore. And you can't just, simply strip out one bank and replace it with another same day, which in the old banking world, because they all operated under similar what's called banking cores, you could do that, but those banking cores are so backwards in their technology. And we looked at all of them and they all said they had APIs, but the developers who are listening to this are going to laugh because we found that really virtually none of them actually did. They called them APIs, but they weren't really.
I see. So a lot of this kind of ties back into the debanking idea of like, if you have a master account at the Fed, then you can't.
Yeah, basically, that's what the statute says. This is in litigation. There are multiple cases because the Fed decided to go through and close a bunch of banks. In the Bitcoin world, you probably saw Peter Schiff talk about the bank that suddenly got closed in Puerto Rico. They lost their master account. And so the Fed has arbitrarily been just going through and closing a lot of Puerto Rican banks. There are a lot of Bitcoiners in Puerto Rico, and they told me about this a little over a year ago, that just arbitrarily the Fed went through and just closed a bunch of Puerto Rican bank master accounts. And it's happened. You can see it in the data. The Fed is just arbitrarily, yanking master accounts. It's in litigation, both who has access to master accounts, like a new applicant like us. There's also a case from one of the Puerto Rican banks that lost its existing master account, whether the Fed had the authority to yank that existing master account as well. It's the same statute. The statute says the Fed shall provide services to eligible depository institutions. And the legislative history shows that that's exactly what Congress meant, because they wanted everybody at the time in the Monetary Control Act of 1980 on the exact same US dollar payment system. And there was a big deal cut because a lot of banks were outside of the Federal Reserve System back in the 70s. It was part of the reason why they had trouble getting control of inflation in the 70s. They wanted everybody inside the system. And the deal that was cut was everybody comes into the system, gets access to the Fed's payment services, and in exchange, you had to hold a certain amount of reserves. That was the deal that got cut. And the Fed is now trying to rewrite history. That is exactly the topic of the lawsuit. But to your point, if a crypto native company had a Fed master account, then as an industry, we would have control of our own destiny, as opposed to having to go through one of the incumbents who is naturally not going to be crypto native.
That makes sense. I see what you're saying now. From like a big picture, long-term perspective, how do you think the future of banking will evolve? Like, can you maybe outline your pessimistic case of like, hey, all these crypto companies and Bitcoin companies get cut off, what happens? And then maybe your optimistic case of like, you get a Fed master account and no one can touch you and you're free to do whatever you want. Like, can you kind of outline those two scenarios?
Well, we'd never be free to do whatever we want because we'd obviously have to continue to comply with the law. And the Fed would have the ability, if we were a Fed member bank, the Fed would have the ability to regulate us, right? So that I just want to make that very clear. Of course, you have to comply with the law as a regulated bank. So it's not be able to do anything you want. But that's the best case scenario, is that the industry has this. And the industry really did step up. Look at who came from across the board in those 7 amicus briefs. The industry and the state of Wyoming really did step up to support the fight here, not Custodia per se, but the fight for the industry's ability to bank. And I'm grateful for the trade associations doing what they did to really join us and support us in that fight. Worst case scenario is that, there's another Biden-Warren administration that, the Genslers of the world and the Michael Barrs of the world are emboldened, and what we saw in the first Biden administration was just an amuse-bouche of what is to come, which is that they try to kill us again. They won't succeed, but they would certainly run all the players offshore.
Yeah. So I guess, would you say that like an aggressive Fed or an aggressive like regulatory regime debanking Bitcoin and crypto companies, is that like a roundabout, like kind of inadvertent way to like effectively ban Bitcoin and crypto? Like if they think they can cut it off fast enough, then they think that they've got enough people trapped in the current system still, and that's kind of like a ban on Bitcoin? Or would you disagree with that frame?
Well, yes. Certainly had the ETFs not come around, I think that was what the original Biden-Warren or Warren-Biden strategy was. Again, I keep saying Warren because it's now an open secret, not even a secret anymore, that Elizabeth Warren controls the Biden administration's appointees in this area and its policy in this area. So they tried to literally cut it off. And they followed the Bill Ayers rules for radicals approach of just do anything you can and go well beyond the legal boundaries, ignore the rule of law, and just make the industry come sue you. That was exactly what they did. And they did it across the entire government. And the SEC gets most of the attention. But the reason the banking regulators aren't getting most of the attention is because all that happens behind closed doors, which makes it even more insidious. So it's harder to prove. And you don't have direct contractual privity with the regulators. That's why the Custodia case was so important, because we actually had the ability to get what's called standing. And it's a big part of jurisdiction in the law. You actually have to have a direct relationship with the bank regulator to be able to sue them. Part of the problem is if you're an entrepreneur who lost your bank account, whether individually or your company, you can't sue a bank regulator because you wouldn't be able to prove that that's why you lost your account. And the Bank Secrecy Act makes it illegal for the bank to disclose why they closed your account. So you wouldn't be able to approve it. And if you sued your bank, they would say, because confidential supervisory information, we're not permitted to disclose that. And then you'd never be able to sue the regulator. So it's really hard to get standing to sue a bank regulator, which is, again, one of the reasons why the industry came so hard in support of Custodia, because they knew exactly what was going on. The industry was getting debanked right and left, lots of illegal and certainly unethical and very questionable activity happening behind the scenes.
In this frontier moment, Caitlin is talking about the crypto and Bitcoin industries getting debanked left and right. What's interesting is that the concept of debanking companies and new industries is not new at all. Few people know that PayPal, which was actually founded in 1998, also faced significant challenges in finding stable banking relationships. Initially, traditional banks viewed their business of online payments as high risk due to concerns about fraud, regulatory compliance, and just the overall newness of the internet. And now back to Caitlin.
With bank regulators pressuring banks not to do business with this industry. And again, lots of litigation, but that's the point. Like, this is what this group has decided to do. So if Biden gets reelected again and they double down, just wait. I mean, they clearly on the banking side want Europe or Canada. They want a very small number of very large banks that they control. And if you look at the enforcement actions, the first quarter enforcement actions from the FDIC, more than 50% of them were aimed at banks that had fintech partners, and only 3% of the banks serve the fintech industry. So you actually had technically more than half of the enforcement actions aimed at the 3% of banks that serve the fintech industry, including crypto. And the other skewed enforcement action group was small banks. They really just don't want more banks in this country because they want a very small number of very large banks. That is ugly. And I think if there is a second Biden term, you should expect that they will try to come at us again using the Bill Ayers rules for radicals. We'll just do everything we can to kill you. And they're really going to be going after the small banks, and especially the small banks that serve rural industries that are politically incorrect in the eyes of the progressive left, like oil and gas, like cattle, like mining, like firearms. It'll be Operation Choke Point 3.0 on steroids.
Yeah, it's pretty scary. I mean, I obviously hope that doesn't happen at all. I mean, like, how bad could it get? Like, are they really just crack down on everything? Is this kind of like a trend that would continue and until the only industries that are remaining are just like the few industries that they really like, or the few people that they really like? Or how do you think about that?
Yeah, that's what's scary about it. And I'll give Davis Polk the quote that said, these court decisions in the Fed master account case gave unfettered, and now I'm talking not just about the Custodia case, there were a couple of others as well, gave unfettered, non-judicially reviewable discretion to non-elected bureaucrats to pick and choose who gets to bank. And that is as scary for, say, the pro-choice and the pro-life industry, to quote them, the freedom of religion and the freedom from religion groups. And they had a whole list of sort of left and right contrasts like that, right? You should not, in the United States, have to worry about whether you can bank based on who is in the White House. This was never power that was granted to the bank regulators. They've taken it. They've been sued multiple times. The FDIC settled the original Operation Choke Point lawsuit and agreed never to do it again. Well, you know what they did? They did it again. They've been violating the settlement in that lawsuit. It's just they did it against a different industry. The industry that they settled with in the first Operation Choke Point lawsuit was the payday lenders. They've been doing it against the crypto industry and against the fintech industry. And so, again, this whole question of standing, it's really tough. This is why you don't see a lot of lawsuits. David Zaring, who's a professor who submitted an amicus brief against Custodia in the district court, has a really interesting paper called The Corporatist Origins of Financial Regulation. He's coming at it from the perspective of challenging the corporatism, how basically financial regulation is ultimately protectionist of big corporations, which, holy cow, we're seeing that SEC SAB 121 thing saying, just kidding, the big banks get exemptions, but everybody else, including the crypto industry, still has to comply. That's very corporatist. I openly question the progressives. Why do you think this is okay? That's very corporatist. But this is kind of the point. Like most of us really, most fair-minded, justice-minded people do not believe that you should have to have a certain political viewpoint to be able to obtain a banking relationship in the United States. And yet that is exactly what has evolved and what the court cases have upheld for now, which is why the appeal is so important.
How big of a deal do you think the Bitcoin ETFs were? Like, were you surprised that this happened given all of this crackdown in debanking and the fact that like it's not just, one BlackRock ETF, even though they are kind of the leader, like they've got Fidelity, you've got ARK, you've got a number, 9 or so different Bitcoin ETFs, probably more at this point. Like, what were you surprised? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I was surprised, but I'm not surprised that it ultimately came through the courts. The SEC ultimately was forced into it. And it was interesting because it was Don Verrilli, who was Obama's former Solicitor General, who represented Grayscale in that case. And he wrote the debanking amicus brief in the Custodia case just to put some, to connect some dots. And it's interesting, his background, he was an Obama DOJ official. The Obama DOJ was involved with the first Operation Choke Point. So he had a particularly interesting vantage point. I have no idea. I've never met him, actually. I have no idea whether he had any insight into the first Operation Choke Point or was involved with it at all. He left after the first several years of the Obama administration, but still, he had the connectivity to the people involved in that. So it's so interesting how folks like him have stepped up to support this industry. And so back on your question on the ETFs. I'm not surprised that it was forced through the courts. That's the only thing right now that has forced the agencies to adhere to the law. And so, yeah, but what's fascinating also, the ETFs, the SEC did us a large. I've not been afraid to criticize the SEC, but I've also not been afraid to praise it. They did something really right, thank God, which is that they prohibited the custodians of the Bitcoin in the Bitcoin ETFs from rehypothecating the Bitcoin. I was afraid that they were going to allow rehypothecation because the Wall Street firms all want that. They like privatizing profits and socializing losses. And so they love rolling the dice and saying, well, let's lever up and rehypothecate and just make the assumption that not everyone will want to withdraw at the same time. And that's how fractional reserve banking works. That's how the securities industry works. There's a stunning amount of rehypothecation in securities. But thank God the SEC they made the right decision on that front. The ETF itself can be rehypothecated, but the underlying Bitcoin cannot, which is great. So in that regard, it was positive. But I started writing about this, I think back in 2016, that it was going to be a double-edged sword when the ETF came because the Wall Street leverage-based financialization games were going to come, and they are going to impact spot markets, and we are seeing that, no doubt. It's kicking the price around a little bit, and the ETFs are obviously a huge player in that. I do worry about the leveraged ETFs and about the leveraged futures markets and derivatives markets around Bitcoin. And the big Wall Street firms, boy, they're coming. The fact that they were lobbying the SEC for relief from SAB 121 and some large banks are getting exceptions to SAB 121. That's I don't know why there were balloons in the, in the picture right there. I guess the banks are celebrating, but I'm not celebrating because I think what the SEC did was arbitrary. They created SAB 121 in a manner that was not consistent with the APA, the Administrative Procedure Act, in the first place. And then Congress tried to override it. And then in the end, they said, "Oh, just for our friends, the banks and broker dealers." Just kidding. But everyone else in the crypto industry, you've got to comply with that. Well, Custodia is a bank, so we're in an interesting position because we can comply with the exceptions. They basically said, look, as long as the custodian can segregate the Bitcoin from its estate to prove that if it goes bust, that the Bitcoin won't be part of the estate, then they're giving the exception. Well, the SEC should have said that in the beginning. By the way, I completely agree with that there is a difference between banks and broker dealers versus non-banks and non-broker dealers. And because of the gatekeeping, we can't get banks and broker dealers in the crypto space. So with the exception of Custodia and Kraken Bank, there are not banks in this space. Every custodian is a trust company, i.e. a non-bank. That is very important from a bankruptcy perspective. We're seeing it, unfortunately, play out with the bankruptcies of Prime Trust and of Celsius. I just saw last week that the bankruptcy trustee in Celsius is now suing people who sold out of Celsius before it collapsed for clawbacks. That is how federal bankruptcy works. And if your counterpart is a bank or broker dealer, then you're exempt from that. Banks and broker dealers have special receivership rules. But if your counterparty is not a bank or broker dealer, you can get stuck. And guess what? All of the custodians in this space are not banks and broker dealers, with the exception of Custodia and Kraken Bank.
Very interesting. Kind of with that knowledge of trust and broker dealers, like what does that mean to, the average person that's out there holding, 1 Bitcoin, 10 Bitcoin, 100 Bitcoin, or 0.1 Bitcoin, doesn't really matter. Should they be more cautious of which custodians they interact with, or how would you express that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, not your keys, not your coins. The best thing you can do is invest in your own knowledge or of self-custody and not keep your coins at third-party exchanges. And one of the people who was being sued by the Celsius trustee was out there saying, this is huge because it applies to every centralized exchange. And he was right. Because again, every centralized counterparty in crypto right now is not a bank or broker dealer, with the exception of Custodia and Kraken Bank. Everybody else is a non-bank and can be pulled into these bankruptcy rules where if, God forbid, your custodian goes down, you're subject to these clawbacks and other provisions in the bankruptcy code. I did a big podcast, a debate with Mike Belsha of BitGo on this, on Coinage, about maybe 9 months ago or so. And it's interesting how it's played out, because back then the debate was, can a trust company replicate that kind of protection? And the answer is no, it can't. And that has been played out now multiple times in reality with the bankruptcies of Prime Trust and Celsius and BlockFi, for example. So the answer is be careful. I am optimistic that bringing banks as counterparties to this space is going to give consumers that exact protection that the SEC is saying that it wants. But remember, the bank regulators have to be on board with that. And so legally, the Wyoming Speedy Banks, of which there are 2 operating, Custodia and Kraken, we're legally banks. We're legally depository institutions. And therefore, that question is just not a question for us. So it's going to be fascinating to see now that the SEC has let the ice thaw and said, just kidding, we're not really going to enforce SAB 121 against the banks. What are the bank regulators going to do now? They still haven't defined what the regulatory requirements are for crypto custody. They're going to have to, because it's clear that a number of banks want in. And I will be writing, in fact, started working on it this morning, an essay called "The Banks Are Coming." They are coming into crypto custody. It's just like the ETFs. They were coming, they were here. It's a double-edged sword when they get here. But there are definitely advantages to having a bank be your counterparty for legal reasons.
Well, yeah, so that's interesting. Like when banks do come, and whether it's Custodia or Bank of America or JP Morgan, and do you expect them to be able to say, like, hey, you can deposit Bitcoin here and hold Bitcoin, we'll hold it for you? And maybe like, would you be earning interest on it? Would they lend against it? Like, what would happen in that case?
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope that they're not stupid enough to pay interest on a non-interest bearing asset, because it's just like I said back when I was warning everybody that the leveraged crypto companies were going to fail. Leverage and Bitcoin do not mix, period. And why is it that Celsius was out there? We had a debate, Alex Mashinsky and I had a debate on this. And I pointed out, Bitcoin is inherently a non-interest bearing asset. So if you're paying interest on Bitcoin, you're getting it from leverage somewhere. And when that leverage unwinds, Bitcoin's the apex predator of finance. And you're not going to be able to cover your inherent short position from that your leverage position created for you in the first place, and you're going to fail. I had this very debate with Sam Bankman-Fried at Bitcoin 2021 as well, predicted that he was going to fail. All these leveraged counterparties fail. So when Wall Street comes, they start playing these leverage games, and keep in mind, they don't know how to play any game other than and they like rolling the dice, right? Because it's privatized profits and socialized losses. If they win, the bankers get big bonuses. If they lose, they hand the losses to the taxpayer through the Fed. So this is going to happen. And my warning to everyone has been the same for years. Watch out. If you're going to be doing any kind of leveraging of Bitcoin, you can't go above 1-to-1. I've never said that all leverage is bad. It's the uncovered leverage going above 1-to-1. That's when you start to get in trouble. And the problem is that the accounting systems of both Wall Street and the banking industry are so geared towards these leverage-based financialization games. It's called rehypothecation in securities and fractional reserve banking in Bitcoin. It's the same.
In this frontier moment, Caitlin is talking about how the accounting systems of Wall Street and banking are geared toward rehypothecating securities and fractional reserve banking. I've heard her previously talk about the Dole Food Company, which in 2017, it was found that the number of Dole Food shares claimed by investors significantly exceeded the actual number of shares issued by the company. This turned into a huge legal battle over the true ownership of the shares, and it was all due to rehypothecation, which is just when banks or brokers borrow against the collateral their clients own. This obviously highlights the importance of not your keys, not your coins, so you can ensure that you actually have ownership over your wealth. And now back to Caitlin.
In fractional reserve banking and TradFi, traditional banking. It's the same thing. It's essentially making the bet that not everybody will show up to withdraw at the same time, whether it's withdrawing dollars from your bank account or Apple shares from your brokerage account. It's making the bet that not everybody's going to show up at the same time, so that the financial intermediaries can take your assets and play leverage games behind the scenes where they win if they make money, and if they lose, you lose. Okay, so that's ultimately the game that's going to get played. And once they start commingling those assets with Bitcoin, they're going to start to lose track of what their true collateralization in Bitcoin is. And remember, I said once you get above 1-to-1 leverage in Bitcoin, you're by definition insolvent, and it's just a matter of time before that insolvency is uncovered by the market. So I worry that the banks are going to make bad risk decisions because their systems can't segregate out the Bitcoin. The smartest thing that they could do is segregate it out. And that's Custodia's business model. Everything is segregated and not leveraged, so that you know exactly how much Bitcoin you have. And, that's just not the way the banks think. But I have a feeling some of them, just like Celsius and BlockFi and FTX, are going to have to learn the hard way.
Yeah. So if these banks do come in and they play these leverage rehypothecation type games, does that affect the price of Bitcoin in the short term? And is that something that eventually just would blow up, kind of like you're saying, like they can play that game maybe in the short term and then it just ends?
Yes. And I think that's one of the reasons the stock to flow model failed in the last bull market. We didn't get to the predicted price at the high, and we broke through. It used to be that you always had higher lows and higher highs. We broke through that in the last correction. We actually had a lower low. We pierced the previous market, the previous bull market high on the low end of the subsequent bull market. Okay. And so what happened? Why was that? Well, because there was so much leverage in Bitcoin in this last bull market, and it's back. It's just coming in different forms now. It's coming in derivatives markets and the like. We don't see the BlockFis and the Celsiuses that are just unsecured, rolling the dice, trying to pay high interest to Bitcoiners on an asset that inherently doesn't pay interest, and having to get that leverage from somewhere. So we're right now, I haven't seen that game come back yet. It is coming back in different forms, to be clear, because that's how, again, Wall Street rolls, and people hope that they can, get their money out before they collapse. But what I point out to answer your question is it clips the top of the bull markets, and it allows us to pierce the bottom in the bear market. So it's an asymmetric return. It is ultimately bad for every financial asset to have this kind of financialization. In the short term, can it spike the price? You bet, because all of a sudden there's this new demand relative to fixed supply. But when that fixed supply bites, you're going to have a bigger unwind because the price will have run higher than it should have in the short term. And we experienced that. I did a tweet thread on that a couple of years ago, explaining this is why the stock to flow model didn't work. It's not that the model's broken. It's that there was something the model wasn't taking into account, which was how much paper Bitcoin had been created. And it's impossible to measure it because the counterparties don't report it anywhere. So you don't know. We didn't know how leveraged BlockFi and Celsius were. And now we've seen it in other players as well with the earn products, having these huge losses. There was the SEC did an analysis and they were right on this, that there was leverage upon leverage upon leverage. It was a leverage pyramid that had been built up in this space. And a lot of us were warning that that's exactly what was happening. We could see it because we understood how leverage works, but the average consumer didn't know that. And I feel badly because a lot of people got stung by it. And again, this gentleman who was trying to warn everybody, he's been sued personally by the Celsius bankruptcy trustee because he was one of the people who got money out towards the end, and now he's having to give it back. That's the way the bankruptcy code works. So be careful. Anytime somebody says you're getting yield on Bitcoin, you need to ask yourself the question, where is that yield coming from? And I guarantee you the answer is there's leverage in the system somewhere. Beware.
Yeah, I completely agree with that for sure. So what do you think the end game is like with the banking industry? Like very long term, is fractional reserve just a completely unstable system that inevitably blows up? And like, will we eventually transition to a full reserve banking system?
Yes, I do believe that. And the reason I say that is look at history. Every single fiat currency, the US currency wasn't fiat until 1968. So it's only been fiat for, a little over 50 years. A little under 50 years. Well, since 1968. I was born in 1969. So my entire life, I'm about to turn 55. My entire life, it's been fiat. But we've been drawing down our balance sheets by levering up pretty much every year since 1968 in this country. And if you look at the history of fiat currencies, they don't survive. And what makes empires fail? They start clipping their coins because they start recognizing that they can't keep their government spending up as high as it was. This is just a pattern that repeats again and again and again in history, regardless of what the money is. And what ends up happening at the end is that the government just puts so much debt on the cash flows of the economy that they can't support the cash. It can't support the cash flows anymore, and the currency becomes worthless. There is absolutely a point at which that will happen, and a lot of the Keynesians and the modern monetary theorists say that's crack. And it's not going to happen, and deficits don't matter. And we need to be levering up. Hell, we're trying that right now. We've tried that during the Biden administration, and look what happened. Here came inflation. We should have been experiencing deflation, healthy deflation, in the cost of everything going down because of global trade causing the supply chains to become hyper efficient. And because of technology, again, causing costs to become hyper efficient. We should have seen prices going down in a healthy way, not saying deflation as the Keynesians define it, because they always say deflation's unhealthy. Well, I say, hey, the deflation in the technology industry that allows my gadgets to come down in price is great. Most people love that. And, textiles have come down in price. Everything else has gone up, but those two things have not. They've gone down. That's healthy. Most people would love to pay less and get more. But that's not the way the Keynesians and MMTers think about it. And we've seen that experiment, and it's certainly been unpopular. But, how close are we to the edge? We're certainly approaching it, but the honest truth is no one really knows because it's a confidence game. And that means it's impossible to define at what point the world loses faith in the US dollar. I don't see it coming soon. if I thought it was going to come soon, I wouldn't have started a US dollar bank. But beware, because the US dollar system is not healthy. And I love the fact that 2 of the 3 presidential candidates on the US ballot, Kennedy and Trump, have embraced Bitcoin, because that is inherently going to keep a discipline factor on the Fed. And that's really good. And the Trump strategy with the Fed, Kennedy said he would dismantle the Fed, but he hasn't defined what that actually means. Trump has said that he would change the mandate to back the value of the US dollar, which if either one of the 2 of them is elected and they implement what they've said, then the US dollar is likely to get stronger. And all of the money that's been printed, especially in the last several years, would not be reversed, but but we will see the second derivative turn negative. The growth rate is probably going to slow down a little bit. Although I will say, Lynn Alden's right. Nothing stops this train. You can't completely slam on the brakes, because then you would bring in that destabilizing unwind of all the leverage, and nobody wants to live in that world. Even Mises, for those of you who are hardcore Austrians, said you don't want to bring about deflation. So the notion of just completely letting this whole thing unwind is not healthy either. He would, I believe, would be arguing for stop digging a deeper hole for yourself, but don't try to let it collapse either. You would just essentially move to a different regime, which is essentially, I think, what Trump is trying to say, which is let's support the value of the US dollar and buy more time for the US dollar system to continue to exist.
I like that a lot. So basically like saying like, let's not cause, super high inflation right now, but let's also not just let the entire pyramid of leverage unwind. Let the dollar persist for as long as possible. And then we can slowly transition to Bitcoin, as our maybe common savings.
Again, as Saifedean and I said I'm talking about this podcast. This might be 5 years old at this point, that we both think the US dollar system is going to end with a whimper, not a bang. And it's going to go a lot longer than most people think. And sure enough, here we are 5 years later, still having the same debate. People have the ability to vote with their feet. They certainly are voting with their feet globally. But again, look offshore at the demand for Tether. People still also want US dollars. They don't just want Bitcoin.
Are you surprised that Tether became as big as it is today? I mean, I thinking back all through the years, it was, people thought it was like causing the Bitcoin cycles and like thought it was pumping up the price of Bitcoin to like crazy levels, and it keeps persisting. And I feel like unlike, Celsius, BlockFi, and FTX, like Tether hasn't quite died. Are you surprised that Tether hasn't died?
It hasn't died.
Or like, how do you think about Tether?
Well, a couple things. They certainly were not transparent in the early years about their reserves. They did have an issue. They settled the issue about their transparency. The NYDFS, I think it was the New York Attorney General, went after them for not being honest about the reserve backing issues that they had. But I mean, now you've got one of the 24 primary dealers that is out there saying that they have the money. Excuse me. So I think at this point, there's not as much question as to whether they have the money or not. The other interesting question is, will the U.S. government continue to allow it to operate? But obviously, working with a primary dealer, the U.S. could have shut it down a long time ago and didn't. So look, I think that is one of the killer apps of the space. That technology is one of the killer apps of the space. Applying this technology to the US dollar. They figured out how to get product market fit, and they were the first ones to do it. And, the rest is history. I've said many times that if you go back and look at the time when they had banking problems, actually, if you unwind, even like, why did Tether exist? It relates to this banking issue because their US dollar bank lost its correspondent bank. It was Wells Fargo that debanked them, and necessity was the mother of invention. So they created a US dollar on a blockchain to allow the crypto industry to continue to transact in US dollars because it couldn't get banking. So, I mean, again, this is an example of the bank regulators kind of shooting themselves in the foot. But there's something else that I've said is interesting. When they got defrauded, it appears they got defrauded by a Panamanian fintech that absconded with some of the Tether money. This was back in like 2015, 2016. So a long time ago. This is when their reserves did dip down below 100% at the time. And again, it came out after the fact. They didn't disclose it at the time, but they created a pathway to get back to 100%. And I think that's a really interesting case study in how a company deals with financial stress. In the US, it makes you go through the bankruptcy code if you are not a bank. And it's designed to be dragged out, and the estate, the bankruptcy trustee is supposed to bring in assets to the estate. The bankruptcy trustees get paid exorbitant fees in order to do that. But that's their job. This is why they're literally suing individuals in the Celsius case. Well, the Tether financial distress at that time, they, instead of going through a traditional, bankruptcy restructuring type of arrangement, they issued the token that allowed the holders to hold on to it as they were getting back up to par. Well, guess what? It worked. They got back up to par, arguably. Again, like, I can't attest to any of this, but I'm taking the CEO of the primary dealer who swears they have the money's word for it. So anyway, where I'm going is leave the Tether point aside. That was a really interesting case study in how to deal with financial distress, because they had it at the time. This was, again, like 10 years ago now. But instead of going through a bankruptcy court type restructuring, they just cut a deal with their customers. And if you look back at history, they got out of their restructuring probably faster than it would have been if they had gone through a court process. My God, Mt. Gox is just distributing their coins 10 years later. Lord knows how long it's going to take for FTX and Celsius and BlockFi to be completely out of their bankruptcy processes. As a case study in financial distress, which one was faster? And you can look at the facts.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Caitlin, this has been awesome. One last question, if you have time, I'd love to ask you.
Sure.
What do you think is the biggest risk to Bitcoin?
Oh, boy. I mean, candidly, I always say the biggest risk is a zero-day exploit. Every day that Bitcoin exists, the risk goes down exponentially. That's the Lindy effect. But it's not zero. It'll never be zero. This is open source software. I'm not worried about the usual FUD like quantum computing, like a change to the Bitcoin core code that changes the economics of Bitcoin, because the incentives of Bitcoin work. And I do believe that engineers, the cryptographers, if they saw quantum computing coming, they're going to be able to get ahead of it. I worked at Symbiont with one of the engineers who was one of the cryptographers who was credited with breaking SHA-1, Lisa Yin. She was one of the 3 Chinese cryptographers who was credited with breaking SHA-1. She wrote the paper, I think, 11 years before Google actually broke SHA-1 in 2016. So it took 11 years after the theory was created that SHA-1 could be broken. It took 11 years for enough computer power to be amassed to actually brute force break SHA-1. And so that's how long it took. That's how long the cryptographers had a warning that SHA-1 was not ultimately going to continue to be safe. And the security-minded engineers, long before SHA-1 actually got broken, moved off it in most cases. And so I do believe that the Bitcoin core engineers are going to be watching for things like this. It's one of the reasons why I don't think the Bitcoin core code should ever be frozen, because you have to be able to respond to advances in technology like this. Lynn Alden also has a really interesting point in Broken Money, her book, about something coming, I think, in like 2045. And I'm not going to do it justice. So at this point, I won't even describe it. I'll let you read Lynn's terrific book. But it is something that the Bitcoin core engineers are going to have to deal with at that point, which tells me that, again, those who just want to just freeze Bitcoin's code as is, that's not the answer. We should just continue. It's messy, but we should just continue to have open source software development just the same way it's been all along. There's such a financial incentive for folks not to do anything that breaks Bitcoin. And I do believe in the power of crowds, and that the engineers are frankly going to make the right decisions. And if they don't, we can always continue to run the old Bitcoin core. That's one of the beauties of Bitcoin being backwards compatible, is if there's an upgrade that you don't agree with, you just run the old version. And if the old version is that much better, everybody will continue to run the old version. It's one of the beauties of Bitcoin.
Absolutely. Well, Caitlin, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me again. This is awesome. Where can the audience go to learn more about you or Custodia or whatever you want to talk about?
CustodiaBank.com, and I'm on Twitter @CaitlinLong_ and on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thanks, Caitlin. This is great.